Again.
That's all right.
Try it again.
Maybe we'll wait just for a little bit to let people sort of join again so that they can.
Yeah.
How are things with you?
Pardon?
How are things with you?
Fine. We're sheltering, we're safe, and well, trying to keep balanced because it's stressful. Um, so, and how are things with you?
Oh, I'm cooking a lot and of course eating a lot. And Tim's like, come for a walk. I'm like, I have a life to do. But no, we're good. We're lucky that we have a home to be in, and we're not
Yeah.
alone. My cousin, she lives maybe about 40 minutes from here, maybe a little less. She's from Trinidad as well, and I know she's on her own, and she was self-isolating 2 weeks ago because she has a pre-existing condition. So I said to her, send an Uber, and I will send you some stuff. So I sent her a ton of Trinidadian food, and she got the food, and she was like, "Oh my God!" So
That's good. Taking care of others is everything.
It's so wonderful. Anyway, so okay, so let's get back to this. I think we have enough people. So the first thing is speed. The tool has to be given the time to do the work. The ink has to have time to travel down the nib, the ink slit, to the tip, spread across it, or when you apply pressure, it has to fill the gap first. So when you put the tool on the page, you're not writing yet, You're putting the tool on the page and you are waiting. And then you start writing. And the slowest parts are the tops and the bottoms, wherever there's a turn. When you drive a car or you're riding a bike and you see a turn in the road, you don't speed up at the turn, you slow down. So why are you speeding up on the page? And the reason why people speed up is because they think, oh, the page is the letter is this big and the turn is this big, so I can shoot around it. When you're actually having to take more time, the tighter the turn, the slower the movement. So speed is the first thing that you have to consider. Even when you're doing a ruling pen script, the stroke might be quick, but the preparation for the stroke isn't. And then, of course, there are things like posture. Where are you sitting? Where is your chair in relation to the table? How high is the chair in relation to the table? And when you're writing, is your shoulder up like this? Are you holding the shoulder up? Because, of course, after half an hour of that, your neck's hurting, your back's hurting, you're really uncomfortable. Where is the page? Where is the page in relation to you? Do you know where the paper sits so that it's in the correct place for you to see it? Or are you sitting there writing with your head underneath like this, looking at the page? So all these things you have to work out. And these pre-basic videos that I'm doing, I'm basically concentrating on solving all of these problems, because I think it's a really big issue, because if you're uncomfortable, you can't see the page, or the ink, there's too much ink on the nib, or you've not put the nib into the holder properly. There are all these pre-basic issues.
So apparently Paul is not online. I can't see him. Ciao Sara. Ciao Nadia. Nel frattempo is not in.
To be self-critical in my practice, is there a mechanical method? All right, so, you know, do you measure the letters? Well, you know what? You don't need to measure the letters. You know why? You have a guide sheet. And if you have a guide sheet, the first thing you have to do is ensure that the letters are touching the baseline and touching the X height. If they're not touching the baseline and the X height, then they're never going to be the same height. They'll always be a little bit different. Now, when you're working with a pointed flexible nib, that pointed flexible nib, for instance, if you're working with something like a Jalot 303, you can get, by printing off a grid, you can probably get 3 or 4, I can get 5 hairline strokes on a horizontal printed line using a Jalot 303. So if I can get 5 of those on the top and 5 at the bottom, and you are out by 2 lines, 2 hairlines at the top and 2 hairlines at the bottom, that's nearly 50% of the letter you are out by consistently. So obviously the letters are not going to be the same height. Now, there are other things. For instance, are you breathing? So people sit there, you know, I watch this in class, you know, students sit there and they're like, and they're not breathing. So of course you give them a nice long word, because of course you know they're going to suffocate halfway through the word. And they don't stop to breathe. They speed up to finish. Rhythmically and consistently and slowly, the lettering's only going to be erratic because you're running out of air, you're panicking. So by slowing down the breathing and by approaching the lettering slower and much calmer and really sort of taking your time with it, it really helps you to definitely keep breathe. It really
get
helps.
the rhythm also.
But
get the rhythm.
And so many students, I walk around my class and I'm like, put my hand on their shoulder, I'm like, breathe, and they're like, oh, thank you. I'm like, so I think it's a really important, you know, these are really basic things, you know. For copperplate script, you inhale on the upstroke, and as you inhale, your chest moves up, the arm moves up, so the upstroke will be lighter. You exhale on the downstroke because the body's moving down and in, so pressing becomes easier. So these little things really help in helping to produce more accurate letters. Spacing of the letters, you know, do you know what the width of the letter is? So one of the things that I've done with my grids is I developed a grid because I worked out the proportion of the height to the width of the letters. And I get students to work within this parallelogram that I've built for the grid. So the PDF that we've just launched, the free PDF, which is called the Copperplate Script Training Wheels Part 1, it's teaching you to work around the two. Let me grab that sheet. I have it handy. Oh, it must be here. So what I've done is I've put these circles. I have no idea where I'm pointing to. Here we go. And so you come up and you go around the circumference, and you come down and you go around the circumference. And so this trains you to work around, because usually when people do copperplate script, they go across rather than around. And so every time you go across, you're not going across at the same angle. So the spacing between the letters starts to be thrown out, because there's no consistency of how you're approaching, how you're exiting the stroke, how you're creating that exit ligature, and how you're creating the entrance ligature. So that's really important. You know, if you're working with a broad edge script, very simple things. So when I work with a broad edge script, I try to train my students. If I have students for a long time, for like, you know, a couple, two-day sessions, I always say to my students, you need to be able to put that broad edge nib on the page at 45 degrees. And every time you put it down, you have to get it at 45 degrees. So every time you put it down and make a downstroke, you're 45 degrees at the top, 45 degrees at the bottom, and there's 45 degrees all throughout that stroke. Can you do that? Because if every time you put the tool down, you cannot get it at 45 degrees, you can't do textualis. So you have to train yourself to know these angles. You have to know 45 degrees. You have to know 30 degrees. You have to know 55 degrees. You have to know 60 degrees. And once you sort of train yourself, and it's not, you know, it's not a race.
Partly getting the right habits, but also training your eyes together with your muscles, right? So the eye and brain train to see what's wrong and what's right on the paper.
And measuring it, because you know you want to take a protractor and go towards that and go, is this at 45 degrees? And you know, one of the things that, you know, like I have people posting in my group about they're using the training wheels. I've done a half an hour or 45-minute video going through all the exercises. And I've said to them, when you finish a page of an exercise, don't think that you're good enough to go on to the next exercise. Look at the page, correct the page, be brutal with yourself. So how do you correct? Are you touching the lines? Are you heavier at the top or heavier at the bottom? Are you heavier in the middle? Is the line consistent? Is it straight? Is it curved? Are there any curves? Are there any wiggles? Are you over the line? Are you under the line? Are you on the 55? Are you just off the 55? Because, you know, if you're just off the 55, it's wrong. It's, you know, most people are like, oh, well, it's just off the 55. It's close enough. If that's what you're satisfied with, then be satisfied with the lettering that you're producing. You know, you have to be so vicious with yourself. If you really want to improve, you have to see this kind of stuff. Hey, Bigo.
Yeah.
And you know, there's that level of accuracy. You know, when you're doing a set of exercises, I'm not even talking about letters. I'm talking about exercises like making lines or writing a part of a shape that makes up an exercise. Are you rushing through the exercise because you want to get through you want to finish the page? Because that's not practice.
Which brings me back to your first answer, which is speed. Not only speed in writing, but speed in learning. So we have to learn to be patient. Is that correct? Yeah.
And it's so important,
time.
You know.
Take time.
So yes, you do have to train your eyes. Okay, so let me move on to the second question. What's an ideal time frame duration for a practice session? That's a great question. So if you think you can find 45 minutes every day to practice, you are lying to yourself. Because by the time you set all of this up and you sharpen your pencils and you realize that the ink that you have doesn't work on that paper that you've just bought, you know, the really nice, pretty paper that's scented, you've lost 10, 15 minutes. I always tell students, if you can find 45 minutes a day, if you think you can, you'll never be able to do it. Aim for 30 minutes. And I mean 30 minutes of concerted practice. So I've come up with this great idea, right? So you get a big sheet of paper, like, you know, a sheet of card that's like mount board. And so you have the mount board, and on the mount board, it's, you know, it's sort of that big. That mount board has a little piece of tape that tells you where the page should sit, roughly. And you might want to stick some other bits of board on it so it holds pens in place so they don't roll off. And you might want to stick a piece that looks like this so your ink bottle sits there. Because, you know, not everybody has a dedicated space to work. And when you are ready to practice, you go behind the bed and you take it out from behind the bed head. Because, you know, all your paper is underneath the bed, so you have no space under the bed. You take the piece of board from behind the bed head, you put it onto the table, and everything is almost set up. You set it up, it takes 5 minutes, and then you sit down and you start to practice. You can only manage half an hour. Because if you have kids, you know, your kids will come and disturb you. You can manage to say to them, give me half an hour. And they can manage half an hour. Beyond half an hour, you might have some problems. And if you have pets, well, that's another problem, you know, because you could just about manage 20 minutes with a pet. But that
I'm
setup
so
is
guilty. My pet is here.
yeah. But you know, if you sort of heat your lap up and you say, okay, you just sit there. So that's a really good way of setting up quickly. And then when you finish, you just close everything off and you put the thing back behind the bed, because then you don't have to sit down and go, oh gosh, where am I sitting? Or where's my angle? Now, I always tell students, 1 day of physical practice and 1 day of mental practice. The best place to do mental practice is in the toilet. Go to the toilet, take your practice with you, and go through the practice that you've been through yesterday. The physical writing that you've done. Think about it. Look at it. What is wrong with it? Turn it upside down. Really important tip. Turn the practice upside down. And once you've turned it upside down, hey Sarah, once you've turned it upside down, so that's your angle there, right? So you turn the practice upside down, right? And you do this. You look down the angle of the script. So once you do that, you'll see how many of the letters are wavering all over the place.
Yeah, because your brain is not trying to read the word, but just see the strokes. So
and to see the angles and to see the spacing, it's a really, really wonderful way to sort of look at your practice.
Hi, Juliana.
So those are some really, really good tips. And you know, I found that the mental training, I always say to students, calligraphy is 80% thinking and 20% writing.
Wow.
Because if you spend the time thinking, you know, so sometimes what I do is I sit in my studio when I have my studio. I'll sit in my studio like this, and I can see the letter here. And I'll look at the letter and go, okay, so what is this letter supposed to look like? Where are the turns supposed to be? Where is it supposed to touch the line? How is the ink supposed to work? How is the nib supposed to work? And I'll look at the letter here. And so I'm seeing it in my mind, but I'm sort of deconstructing it in front of me. And I'm thinking through, when this letter joins another letter, how does it work? Because if you think through these things, you know, so many people sit and they write page after page after page after page, but at no point are they thinking.
No thinking, yeah.
So if you don't spend the time thinking about the letters, how are you going to know if they're going to work? Are you just hoping that you're going to, just by brute force of practice, you're going to figure it out? So, you know, practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. So you are hammering in all those mistakes into your mind, especially if you're not thinking about it. So that, you know, that 1 day of practice and that 1 day of thinking practice is a really great way of training your brain. So your practical sessions really should be half an hour every other day. And if you can really find the time to do that, then you can find the time to think about it. You know, if you're taking the train to work, spend the time on the train instead of reading a book or something. Think about what you did yesterday. Now, one of the other things I try to get people to do as well is think of your emotions. You know, sometimes you sit down to practice and you're practicing because that's the time you have, right? But are you ready to practice?
Yeah.
Because if you're practicing and you're not ready to practice, you're wasting your time. You have to be ready to practice. You have to, if that's the time you're setting aside to practice, maybe you've had a terrible day. Maybe your arm is hurting. Maybe you're not in the right frame of mind to practice. Okay, look through your work and use that as your thinking practice. Or spend the time looking through a book on illuminated manuscripts. Do some historical analysis. Physical practice is about practice. I also tell my students, have 3 tools. You have a play tool, because you want to sit down and write.
Okay, yeah.
You have a practice tool, which you never ever play with. Your practice tool is a tool that you use when you are ready to learn. I am going to beat myself with this script. That's what that tool is. So your brain will be like, oh, this is not the play tool. We're not playing. We are learning. So it will make that distinction between how the tools work with each other. And if you do calligraphy for a job, you have a work tool, because that's work. Now, I always told my apprentices, there are ways to treat your work. If you're a jobbing calligrapher and you address envelopes, there are ways to treat your work like practice. So for instance, I know that I can write in italic. I can write 40 4-line address envelopes in an hour. I have a really fast italic.
Yeah.
But when I was starting off, I was able to write quite quickly as well, quite quickly and quite accurately. I would only ever do 30 envelopes in an hour, because I would have a little sheet of, not a little sheet, I would have an A4 sheet of paper next to me. If I came across a word that I thought was difficult, I would write it down on the list. If I accidentally discovered something, like I've discovered tons of things, I've addressed millions of envelopes in the last 25 years. Well, I mean, I've been addressing envelopes since I was 16. So, that's more than 25 years. But I've always made notes of things that happen, little accidents. Oh, this shape happened. How did this shape happen? I'm in the middle of a job. There's a deadline. But I've just discovered something and I want to keep a note of it. So that sheet of A4 is so important, and you can use that as your practice. Those of you addressing envelopes for a living, you can use this. You can get paid to practice. You just have to practice differently. It's a slightly different mindset.
Yeah.
And that kind of practice addressing envelopes, nothing can give you that kind of practice, because of course you can't screw up the practice because it's somebody's work. It's possibly a very expensive envelope. So you're having to be really careful and be really conscious of what you're doing. So, there's so much more that you can gain out of addressing those envelopes, especially when it's a client who you really, really are really upset with. And you're like, I don't want to do this job. Don't think of the job as a job for somebody who has been difficult. Think of it as practice. Think of it as something that will help you. I'm just going to throw something in here. You took part in the meditation live today. When I was doing lots of envelope addressing, I started to notice a pattern. So if I made a mistake on a name more than twice, and normally I asked for 10% spares, but I would only make 3% mistakes. And I always told clients that I would make 3% mistakes, but there would always be 5% problems, because they're things that you cannot account for. For instance, sometimes the ink just doesn't take on that envelope, or sometimes the ink will bleed on that envelope. So, if it's English names, I ask for 10% spares. If it's non-English names, I ask for 20% spares. And you should try this out, if you have a client and you end up writing a name more than twice, keep the name aside and ask the client, if you and the client are getting along nicely, ask the client what that person is like. Every time you have a problem with a name, That person is a nightmare. The client will always
Okay.
go, "Oh my gosh, that person's so difficult." So there definitely is a lot of energy associated with writing people's names.
Okay, but mainly we have to be ready to do a good practice session. So if we feel we are not ready, better reading something or thinking calligraphy or whatever.
Or spend some time cleaning your tools.
Oh, yeah.
Because, one of the things that I've noticed, especially if you're using, any ink, particularly stick ink. So between the tines in the ink slit, the ink slit is this high. The ink will coat on the tines and stop them from coming back together. And all you have to do is clean the nib gently. All right, let's see. I'm heavy-handed. Any tips for lightening strokes? So I have a video that I've put out recently dealing with the death grip. There are two ways to do this. You can either hold a pencil with an eraser in the non-writing hand, and that holds the page down. As soon as you do that, it transfers the tension from this hand to this hand. Or you can scrunch up a ball of paper or have like a rubber ball in this hand, and that will help to diminish the tension in the writing hand, and it will help to lighten your writing. It's not magic. It doesn't happen overnight.
I saw that video. It was genius. And I was talking to Heather and Kate about that the other week, was it? It's recent. I mean...
Yeah, it's about 2 weeks old.
Yeah, okay. And I suggest if you, those who are tuned in, if you haven't seen that, go look for it because it's really genius. It's absolutely great practice.
But the thing is, as soon as you hold the pencil, it changes it. But it takes time. It can take months for you to eventually not need the pencil, but to sort of lighten it up enough. And I always have to say this to people: don't think it's magic. It will not happen today. It will not happen tomorrow. It will not happen in a week. It will not happen in a month. It might take you 3 months for it to happen, but you just have to be patient with it, just like you're breathing. What is the best practice for preventing shaky upstrokes? That's a tricky question. So I have a hold that I invented called my PA Scribe Augmented Hold, and that gives me a very different way to write. So there's a video coming out on that in a couple of weeks. And one of the biggest problems with shaky upstrokes is where you're holding the tool. So I'm going to assume whoever asked this question is using an oblique holder. Are you holding the tool here? Look, my thumb is right at the flange, right? If you're holding the tool here, what you're doing when you're writing is you're pushing with your fingers. And as you push with your fingers are saying to you, hello, I'm busy, I'm holding the pen. So you're giving them something else to do. And as you're pushing, you're also pushing down into the paper. So if you move back just a little bit more, so notice I'm not at the flange anymore, move back just a little bit more. And as you're approaching that upstroke, try inhaling. And as you inhale, you'll find that you're lifting the tool as well. Now, I have this great thing that I developed called lift. The lift is magical. So what you do is you have the page here, and you take a couple pieces of paper. So if you're writing here, I'm going to stand for this. So if you're writing here, you take a couple pieces of paper and you put it just about 1 centimeter to 1.5 centimeters from where you're writing. So it raises the page by 0.5 millimeter. And as you're writing, the nib comes up, the paper comes up to meet the nib on the upstroke because you're raising it. And as you come down, the nib goes down to meet the paper. So the upstrokes become twice the thinness that you're accustomed to, because you're skating on the paper, because the paper comes up to meet the nib. And so you're not pressing on the nib for the upstroke, you're sort of skating on the surface.
Okay, so it's sort of, I've heard it mentioned as a cushion, or when you put a newspaper.
So couching is different. Usually couching, when you couch a surface, you've actually put something under the whole surface.
Yeah.
This is just the edge of the surface.
Okay, okay.
So the page is just a little bit. And so there's a lot more interaction. You know, the problem with couching is when you couch the whole surface, it can be very inconsistent in how that couching works underneath the page. And, you know, I'm talking about...
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, if you don't find the right setting, it's tricky.
And I'm talking about, you know, 0.5 millimeters movement. That is all you need to produce a smoother, a more delicate upstroke. And, you know, the shaking lines, shaking lines come from holding the tool too tightly. I tell students, don't squeeze the tool. And they're like, if I'm not squeezing the tool, I don't have control. I'm like, yes, but you're holding the tool like this. You know, if you're doing this, you're obviously going to shake, right? If you just sort of think, okay, just relax, put the tool down. I always say, put the tool down. Pick the tool just a little bit more. So notice I'm not at the flange anymore. Move back just a little bit more. And as you're approaching that upstroke, try inhaling. And as you inhale, you'll find that you're lifting the tool as well. Now, I have this great thing that I developed called the lift. The lift is magical. So what you do is you have the page here, and you take a couple of pieces of paper. So if you're writing here, I'm going to stand for this. So if you're writing here, you take a couple of pieces of paper and you put it just about 1 centimeter to 1.5 centimeters from where you're writing. So it raises the page by 0.5 millimeter. And as you're writing, the nib comes up, the paper comes up to meet the nib on the upstroke because you're raising it. And as you come down, the nib goes down to meet the paper. So the upstrokes become twice the thinness that you're accustomed to, because you're skating on the paper, because the paper comes up to meet the nib. And so you're not pressing on the nib for the upstroke, you're sort of skating on the surface. Okay, so it's sort of, I've heard it mentioned as a cushion, or when you put a newspaper. So couching is different. Usually couching, when you couch a surface, you've actually put something under the whole surface. Yeah. This is just the edge of the surface. Okay, okay. So the page is just a little bit. And so there's a lot more interaction. You know, the problem with couching is when you couch the whole surface, it can be very inconsistent in how that couching works underneath the page. And, you know, I'm talking about... Sorry? That letter's really nice. Oh, I really like that. Oh, I'll just take a note of that. Oh, and you're scrolling through. Oh, look at that. That's really nice too. I'll take a note of that. So if your M does this and your A does this, the M and the A are supposed to be the same. They're in the same group. But if you've chosen an M that is a Spencerian M, and you've chosen a copper plate A, and you're trying to write them together, they're not going to work. Do you know that they're not going to work? So knowing how the letters work together as a group is really important. Guilty, 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 guilty. Yeah.
We've been
If
there. We've all been there.
if you have to work with the absolute basic. What is the most basic set of letter forms that I'm working with? And are they in a group? And if they are in a group, practice them in their groups. So you practice A, M, V, and W, and N. Because the N is different to the A, M, V, and W. And after I published my manual, I was going through the manual. I was like, but something's wrong here. Because, you go through everything again. There's so much to add to this manual. Because there's so much more information that is always available. You look at historical examples, you do some research, you sit and you think about the process. So, working with one manual or one worksheet is really important. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's great to look at historical copies, historical documents, writing master copybooks. It's really wonderful to look at them. They're really inspirational, but let them inspire you. Don't feel that you're ready to copy them or, to figure them out in order to write them. Stick to one thing. I always tell students, one script at a time. You see somebody posting stuff and every time they post, it's a different script. That's not learning. You're not learning. That's very counterproductive. Pick a script, stick to it, learn the script. Your uppercase is a different set of rules to your lowercase. The majuscules are derived from the capitalis monumentalis, or the imperial capitals, and the minuscules are derived from the half uncial. They are two different scripts. When you're writing, one of the things I discovered with copperplate script is when you're writing the majuscules have an elliptical practice that is anti-clockwise. So you do this and you go up into the A, and you go up into the M, and you go up into the top of the B. But the minuscules work in the opposite direction. And you're like, oh, what's going on here? They are two entirely different alphabets. So, you're not just learning one alphabet, you're learning two completely separate alphabets. That's why mixing the letters is really difficult. You have to know the majuscules before you mix them with the minuscules. So you have to be really, really careful with that. Oh my gosh, Vienna's library. Wow. So much subtle in schrift as well, just brilliant. So obviously I don't just do copperplate. I do Spencerian, I do some modern calligraphy, I do, tons of broad edge scripts. I love my broad edge scripts. Rustics is one of my favorite hands. Of course, the whole family of Gothic scripts I absolutely adore. I love Italic. I love Cancellaresca. I think Cancellaresca is just so expressive. And so, learning different tools and how those tools work and being more accurate with the tools is really important. Calligraphy is not guesswork. It's about producing something consistently and accurately, which can only be done slowly. Let's see. So sticking with one model for a period of time, or is it fine to look at various models, right? Okay. For beginners, do you suggest to study with historical manuals or modern publications? I trained as a calligrapher and heraldic artist. So when we were at Reigate, I was trained by Gina Goff. Gina made us go into the library. She said, okay, so we're going to work on Italic. So I want you to go and find a writing master that you like and emulate his work.
Wow. And
she taught us to do something called a script analysis. Now, a proper script analysis takes, a quick script analysis can take 45 minutes. A proper script analysis can take anywhere between 3 to 5 hours.
Wow.
And you get a copy of the script, a copy of the thing you're looking at, and you go to a photocopier and you enlarge it so it's large enough so that you can see the structure of it. And then you enlarge it so that it is at the right size of a certain nib at a certain size. So like a Speedball C2, like a Speedball C2 nib. So that's a pretty big nib, right? And then you look at the whole thing, you find all the letters, you put them aside, you put them in their groups, you take a protractor, you work out the angle of the script, you work out what the angle of the nib is, you work out what the, and from that, you can work out the speed of the writing. I mean, it's, a script analysis is just mind-blowing. And once you start doing script analyses, you're hooked, right? You're just like, you've got salivating, foaming at the mouth when you see a new script. You're like, oh, script analysis time. So it's a really wonderful and important thing to learn to do. And looking at the historical models, you know, I write copperplate script with a straight holder because historically, English roundhand was written with a straight holder. Engravers and engrossers were written with an oblique holder because they were invented around the time that the American penmen were using oblique holders for Spencerian script. That's why the deposition of weight in engrossers and engravers is different. You know, you'll find that the weight is lower or higher. Not so with English copperplate script. It's in the middle. English roundhand is very different from English copperplate script for a number of reasons, which I'm not really going to go into here. But suffice to say, when English roundhand and English copperplate script were at their pinnacle, they were done with a straight holder. So obviously the best thing to do them with is a straight holder. Why are you using an oblique holder for a script that was done with a straight holder and then complaining that you're not getting the letters to look the same? You have to pick the tool that was used, that was in use at the time, at the pinnacle of the script, and that's what you have to work with. So you know, looking at historical examples, historical exemplars is really important, but also understanding things like, what was the technology like? You know, have you tried writing with a quill? You know, when I teach Batard, or there's this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful script called Lettres de Bourgogne, which is this blend, glorious, beautiful blend of Batard and Fraktur in Burgundy, written by this scribe called Nicholas Speronic for the Master of Mary of Burgundy manuscripts. Glorious script. Absolute nightmare to write. And you start, you know, when I teach it, I normally teach Textualis first, then I teach Fraktur, then I teach Batard, and then I teach this Lettres de Bourgogne script because it's such a blend of the scripts. And you then have to think, you know, what angle were they writing it at? Were they writing it flat? Because if you're writing flat and you're writing with a quill, the ink will just go.
Yeah. So
you have to be working on an angled board. So, you know, a lot of pointed pen calligraphers don't work on angle boards, and you know, for them it's a very, very alien thing. So, you know, understanding what the historical source is teaching you is really important. Now, you mightn't have access to that. You mightn't be knowledgeable enough to discern mark making from what you're seeing and extrapolating what the technology was. So you might have to work with contemporary source books and contemporary models, but you have to spend the time to look for good models. You know, so often I see people practicing things and I'm like, what are you doing? Like, oh, this is the practice, this is the exemplar I have. And you look at the exemplar and you're like, but this is terrible. Did you look at this? Did you compare it online, or did you just think, oh, it was pretty and this is what you want to work with? You know, you're only going to be as good as what you're seeing on that sheet. And if the information on that sheet isn't really up to mark, then you're going to run into a problem. So how to tell when the information is good? Are the letters the same? Are they accurate? Are they the same weight? Are they the same widths? Are they the same interlinear space? Are they touching the X height and the baseline? You know, I've seen people give out exemplars and it's a copperplate script and the letters on the baseline, but it's not touching the X height. And the ascender line is, the ascender is nowhere near the ascender line. and the descender is nowhere near the descender line, well, what is the point in having an ascender line and an X height and a descender line when you're not touching them? So you have a 55-degree line on the page. Is the line on the 55? If it's not on the 55, that's a problem, right? So you know, it's not that difficult to look at an exemplar and really sort of think, is this what I really want to be practicing with?
Mm-hmm.
So
okay, so have both, because we are practicing with modern tools. Paper is definitely not a vellum or anything that existed in the Middle Age or whenever it was. So modern publications, but also script analysis based on its historical manuals and exemplars, right?
So that, yes, exactly. So, you know, so let's look at contemporary tools versus historical tools. Most people can't get historical tools. You know, I'm fortunate. I have access to quills and vellum, and I can grind my own pigments. But a lot of people have to suffice with contemporary tools. And, you know, modern nibs are brilliant. You just have to understand what they can do. And of course, you can't figure that out while you're writing. Mm-hmm. You have to figure that out before the writing. What does this nib do? Can I make a straight line with it? So, for instance, let's look at a browser nib versus a William Mitchell nib. A browser nib has a slight angle on the nib. So if you want a stroke where the horizontal line is on the X height, the nib is on the X height, and it finishes on the baseline, and it's a perfectly straight stroke, flat at the top and flat at the bottom, you have to turn the nib a little bit. Yeah. With a William Mitchell, it's completely straight, but the tines are longer, the nib is sharper, and the tines are softer. So if you press, it's going to spring open. But did you know that? Did you know that that's the main difference between those two tools? And if you're writing with a nib like a browser, it's a much more rigid nib. It's much harder to write with. But if you look at something like a manuscript pen company round hand nib, their nibs are just chamfered on the corners. So they don't give you a super sharp edge, and they don't cut into the paper. So do you know what the tool can do? No, you haven't done any of that, but you're writing with it and you're struggling. Okay, so why am I not getting this letter? I'm really bad at this. You're not bad at it. You're just not good at the tool. So you have to spend the time learning about the tools, what make straight lines, make vertical lines, make horizontal lines, change the angle. And if you're working with pointed nibs, personally, I don't use Nico G's. I don't use Zebra G's because they're too blunt and they're too hard. I mean, I always say to people, you could put a Nico G in a gun and shoot an elephant and it will kill it. Because it is a brutal nib. It is so hard, but it's not made for calligraphy. G nibs are made for manga illustrators. So, you know, they're applying a lot more pressure. Now, do you know what a G nib feels like in relation to something like a Hunt 22B nib? So with a Hunt or a Gillot 303, or even a Gillot 1066A, or a Browser 66, or a Browser 65, the G nibs, when you're writing, they're so slick and they're so coated that when you get down to the bottom, they roll on the bottom, right? You're not feeling what's happening. You can't feel through that much metal. Now, if you're writing with a Hunt 22B and you get to the bottom, for the whole nib, when the tines open, you know, the tines open and they do this, and you can feel them on your ears. So this tine is moving in this way and that, and you can feel all of that happening right here. You can feel it through the nib. When you get to the bottom and the tines come back together, you sort of feel it pulling into you. And you can feel every single movement and indentation on the paper and how it works and how the nib is moving if you're writing slowly, obviously.
Yeah.
But you can't feel it with a G-nib because they're so smooth and they do some of the work for you. Well, if they're doing some of the work for you, you are not doing that work. And if you are not doing that work,
yeah.
How do you know what's happening on the page?
Yeah.
So, you know, when I've tried writing with G-nibs, and I've had to put them down. I've had to press so hard to get something out of them. I'm like, what is this? How do people use these nibs? I remember sending a calligrapher who lives in Hong Kong. I sent her an email. I said, your work's really beautiful. I can't believe you're doing this with a G-nib. Because you have to press so hard. And so what does that do? It stops you from learning the one thing you need for copperplate script, which is delicacy of touch and lightness of movement. So it's counterproductive. Okay, fine, it might be great to start off with it as a beginner, but you know, you have to graduate. How many of you start off with a nib and that's it? That's your nib. Well, you're getting better. As you get better, the tool needs to get better. So you have to start off. You need to start changing the tool. Now, one of the problems is you mightn't have access to tools. You don't have the same access to tools that I have access to. So you need to figure out what you have access to. You know, for a beginner, I would start a beginner off with a G-nib because they might be pressing too hard. But by the end of a teaching session, which my sessions are normally a Saturday and Sunday class from 10 to 5. So I start you off with a G-nib at maybe 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, because the whole morning is pencil work. And then you start with it Sunday morning from 10 to 11, and then we move to another nib. So I like the Gillot 1066-68A nib for a beginner. The Gillot 404 is a little bit more rigid. The 1068A it's a little bit scratchy. But the aim is to teach you how to feel what's happening with the nib.
Yeah, they're different, yeah.
So it's really important that you revisit the nibs that you're using. Have I been using this for long enough? Am I so comfortable with it that I'm sloppy? You know, do I need to graduate to another nib? You know, one of the things, so there's this thing that Telmo and I did. We did this thing called the Essential Information Extracts. So from my manual, I took 18 pages and I made it free, because I believe that there are things in here that people have to have access to for free, like whole arm movement for left-handers and right-handers, posture, placement, position, oblique holders versus straight holders. And then we did this. So I know this is in reverse. So this is something called suggested interactions. And so it tells you which paper and which nib and which ink work together. So, you know, all of that information is free. You could go and download it and you know, just go to town with it. There's even a group on Facebook for it. You know, I have so many groups. Crazy.
I don't know whether those who are listening know where to purchase your book. So since we are talking about your manual, can you please remember everybody where to log in and find to purchase your manual?
So you can find information on the manual if you go to my bio on Instagram and you go to the Linktree link. There's some links there, and you know, you can find the manual in there. Remember, if you download the manual, if you purchase the manual as a download, you can't print it off. It's only for tablet or on-screen visibility and usability. You know, you can purchase the manual if you want a physical copy. I heard today that Scribblers have sold out. They have no copies of it left.
Okay, are they supposed to print or?
Well, we're just waiting to see how many are left. But, you know, this coronavirus situation has been a real issue because, you know, as I'm talking about product, I'm just going to...
New pads!
New pads!
Yay.
So the pads are
These are amazing. I've seen them in a preview a few days ago.
But like they were supposed to be out now.
Yeah.
And Rodia said to me, our factory's shut. You know, we're probably looking at maybe the end of June, the beginning of July, possibly the end of July. And so, you know, everything's on hold. So, you know, even trying to, hi Heather, even trying to reprint the manual is difficult because we have to get all that information together. And so,
hold on.
hey,
Yeah, okay.
Sharon, how are you? Right. So why are there models referring to copperplate as round hand? Which is the difference, if any?
Last question.
So it's a very complex question for a number of reasons. I've studied hundreds of writing master copybooks, you know, from across the continent, focusing on English writing masters. I've been really fortunate to see some absolutely beautiful copybooks and have access to them and, you know, sort of be able to touch them and hold them. The Victoria and Albert Museum and the British Library have, and the Pepys Library have absolutely wonderful collections, as well as the Parker Library. Of course, you know, they're not the easiest things to get to because they're in the Rare Books collection. So I break up our script writing into different periods. Roughly, we start at around 1604. So Lucas Matereau was a scribe in Avignon, and there was another scribe in Paris called Louis Barbadeau. These two took Cancelleresca Corsiva and they altered it to create something that I refer to as proto-English roundhand, because it's not strictly English roundhand. Now, prior to that, in England, you have two scripts in use. You have Bastard Secretary and you have Cancelleresca, because Elizabeth I's tutor was trained in Italy. So he taught her Cancelleresca. That's why she has that E with the flourish Z at the bottom. But most people wrote in Bastard Secretary. So Chaucer and Shakespeare are written in Bastard Secretary. When the Dutch king had very strong ties with England, and of course they had a Flemish current schrift, which utilized pressure as well as tilting onto the corner of the nib. So this really amazing confluence of scripts that develop and find their way to England. And they enter into this amazing melting pot. And we see the development of this proto-English roundhand, which by 1645 was a set hand written in England. Now, the English were very lucky at this time because they had this amazing mercantile trade just booming. And just around that time, they started to travel all over the world. And of course, they had to take notes and make ledgers and keep notes on ships. And so this script started to develop out of writing a Cancelleresca hand with a quill. Now, George Bickham has a book called The Accomplished Clerk. And in that book, he explains how to write this English roundhand. And at some point he says, move onto the flat of the nib, and as you go around the turn, rock onto the top right corner.
Okay.
Now, that immediately tells you that this is not a pointed nib. Because if they're telling you move onto the flat of the nib, then
you have to have a flat side.
You have to have a flat, right? So there's a lot of rocking in this Proto-English roundhand script. That's why I call this period Proto-English roundhand. Because later on, with the invention of quill cutters, when you could stick the nib in and cut it, you get a point. You get a shift to using more pressure rather than tilting. And that's when the script starts to change. So that's when you really come into English roundhand. Sibylla, you're following me? How's that sounding?
Okay, so it was just a few decades, if I got it right. You mentioned 1604 to 1645. Okay, so that was very quick development.
No time at all.
Yeah.
But it occurred because there was so much writing that was needed. So because you had this absolute explosion in the necessity for writing, you had this very swift evolution.
Okay.
So
I'm
just talking to you about historical studies that I've done and that I've researched, things that I've never really talked to people about. Only really Telmo, that I've sort of spoken to about this kind of thing.
We love that. We love this. Okay,
so then we move from this tilting to a pointed flexible quill that we can press. Now, this is where it starts to get interesting, because if you don't cure the quill properly, you can't press on it because it will just go.
Yeah.
So not only are you having to cure the quill, you're having to cut it slightly differently so the tines are shorter. Because if the tines are longer, they spread too much. I'm just waiting for a few more people.
Okay. Everybody's is in again. Okay.
So you have these little shortened tines, and then along comes the Industrial Revolution. And so you have these metal nibs that are being made. And so British mercantile trade explodes, and Britain goes all over the globe, taking their nibs and their script with them. Now, this is when I tend to call things copperplate script, because not only do we have a pointed, flexible metal nib, we also have engravers trying to replicate that script. Now, lots of broad edge calligraphers will tell you that copperplate script is derived from an engraver's burin. It's a lie.
Oh, okay.
There is no other way to say it, and there is no need to say it kindly and say, well, it's maybe a stretch of the truth. It's a lie. Copperplate script did not come out of an engraver's burin. It evolved out of Cancelleresco cursiva. It's a very complex evolution of scripts that have come together: bastard secretary, Cancelleresco cursiva, a bastardized Cancelleresco from Avignon and Paris, and the Flemish current script used in the Netherlands. That's a really complex, melting pot required to produce something. So to say that the script came out of an engraver's burin is so offensive, because the script is really beautiful and really wonderful, and it needs to have this its own history. So fine. So the word copperplate came about because of Johnston's students. So Edward Johnston was writing a script called Foundational, which was also called Roundhand. But the English roundhand wasn't as round as roundhand. And because roundhand was being used by Johnston's students, they didn't want you to mix it up with the English roundhand. And they didn't like
You're confusing us.
They didn't like the English roundhand because in the arts and crafts period, they wanted to go back to something that was written beautifully, and they equated English roundhand with financiers and bankers. And so you had this group of people wanting to be more arts and crafts oriented rather than more moneyed oriented. And so they sided, the pre-Raphaelites and the arts and crafts movement, and Johnston and his students decided to call this script copperplate because copperplate is what it was used for principally. That's where the name comes about, and that's where that confusion is.
The name copperplate is recent.
Yes,
definitely.
So it's it's a late 19th century term used to describe the script.
Okay, so
But also, you know, you have to be conscious of how copper plate is not English roundhand, because English roundhand is different to copper plate because of where the weights are. So that's a little bit more technical.
okay, that's
Now,
technical. Okay.
let's go on a little bit more. So when the script was taken to the United States and the US, the 13 states decided to leave England, they wanted to write out their constitution. And of course, they wrote it out in English roundhand. But they didn't want it to be called English, right? Because they didn't want to be English anymore. So they called it another name. And so the name that they applied to this kind of script is engrossers. Of course, engravers is a different script. So the engravers would cut copperplate script at a certain angle. But when you cut, I've studied copperplate engraving as well. When we call it striking. When you strike the letter, if you have an O, you would cut this side. And if there's an A next to it, you cut that side. So you cut all of this side. Then you turn the plate around, you cut it that way. That's why there's a break, because you could never quite join them up. So it was better to leave a break. So engravers has breaks in it, whereas engrossers doesn't. And of course, because you have the oblique holder being used for Spencerian now, because of course, Spencerian wasn't written with an oblique holder. Spencer actually wrote it with a straight holder. His sons invented the oblique holder.
Yeah, Cecilia is excited.
His sons invented the oblique holder. And when you have this oblique holder writing, you're not at 55 degrees. You're generally just off the 55. Now, because the holder is flatter, as soon as you apply pressure, it springs open. Well, that's a feature of Spencerian. You want the tool, you want the nib to spring and snap together. But when it springs open at a flatter angle, he did use a quill. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder what kind of quill he used. When you apply pressure to the holder, it springs open and the pressure is in a different place to where copperplate script is. That's why you see engrossers, and engrossers looks like it's leaning forward a little bit more.
The head is lower.
If you look at the B, the ellipse, the double ellipse on this side, they are here and there and at the top, rather than, and then of course they go back in and they add additional, or as I call it, fiddling. They add fiddling to it. Yeah. And so you have all these different scripts, and they're related to each other, but they are not the same thing.
Okay,
so I hope that has cleared up everything.
Yeah, roundhand and copperplate refer to two different scripts, right?
Now, there is an Italian copperplate, which is very different to the English copperplate script. And I'm not talking about Italian. I'm talking about, you know, if you look at Italian writing master copybooks, their script is thinner and narrower and much lighter and much more sort of expressive and vivacious. It's very different. And then, of course, there's a French version to copperplate script. Even though it's called l'anglaise, it's still not l'anglaise. So, you know, there are stylistic variations that you have within the family of the copperplate name. So it's, you know, there's a lot around it. It's just the research is not. It's very few of us have done any research on it and presented research and such. I mean, Sibyl's research has been great, and when you read some of the stuff that she's put together on it, it's really, really good, really, really good, really fascinating.
Just a thought, because everybody is commenting, oh, how fascinating, how interesting, etc.
Write a book.
When all this craziness of the COVID-19 will be over, what about putting together a 2 days workshop on history of the copperplate script? Will you be available?
I don't think you could cover that in 2 days.
Okay, we can do modules.
Yeah, we can definitely do modules.
2 days. I don't
And
know.
you know, we can start off with the base script, and look at Lucas Matero's script, and look at Louis Barbador's script, and then look at the earliest sort of samples of this proto copper plate that I've found here. Oh, look at Kate. She's like, oh my God. I think it's a great idea. I think it's a really wonderful thing to do. But, you know, equally, as much as I love talking about script, about copperplate script and the pointed pen scripts, you know, one of the things I would love pointed pen people to
there's so much misinformation out there.
There is a lot of misinformation, and, you know, Instagram has a lot to blame for. One of the things I would love to get pointed pen people to do is to really try to write with a broad edge nib. You know, the scripts that you write with a pointed nib, they come from somewhere. They come from somewhere that those of us who've trained in historical scripts, they come from a place that we love. We really, really love what's possible with a broad edge nib. You know, when you look at something like rustics, which is this Roman script from the 2nd to the 4th century, it's magical. And there are so many variations of it. And it is so beautiful and so sexy and so sensuous, because the line moves in this really, oh, wow, it's so, and, you know, to get you guys trying some of these scripts, you know, I was talking to Kate about things like pointed Anglo-Saxon minuscules and Northumbrian and Southumbrian scripts. They're really wonderful. There's so much to try.
What's a good broad edge nib to try?
I like my Mitchells because I write very lightly. If you press hard, a browser will work for you, or a manuscript pen company that will work for you. I love Speedball. Absolutely love Speedball. You know, my first set when I was 9 was a Speedball set.
Nice.
And I still have the holder.
Really? Do you? Yeah.
So, you know, there's so much. Will you do a demonstration with broad edge nib? After I finish, what now?
Not now.
Not now. After I finish my my copperplate week, I still need to make a decision on what I'm doing. I might do a week actually systematically going through the manual, because, you know, copperplate script is in people's time, and I know always so much to learn. So I might do a week actually systematically going through the manual. And then I'm going to decide on which broad edge script to try. So I might start with my postcode small caps, which is something that I developed to do postcodes with a pointed nib. But, you know, the study will be to go through from a pencil into a broad edge nib, into a pointed nib. Or I might just do some textualis, probably some fraktur, and then move on to some rustics.
Okay, so hopefully we've answered, what's your name again? Super Penji. Okay.
Okay, so I think that's it.
So, yeah, time to wrap it up.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Thank you so much for your time.
It was so
Thank you, Kate.
So lovely to have you. Thanks everybody who tuned in for our live. We'll keep the live for the next 24 hours on Instagram, and then the full videos will be available on YouTube. Okay, so it was lovely to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. Have a good day. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.